Our next presenter is Ben Parvey. As founder and CEO of Blue Sky Power, Ben Parvey has dedicated his professional career to building a clean and resilient energy future. As self-described recovering public finance attorney, Ben oversees the implementation of the innovative finance structures and transactional implements of Blue Sky's clean energy projects, in addition to advancing the strategic growth of the company. Ben's passion for taking customers off the grid by creating innovative projects has led to over $200 million of clean energy projects for government, leading companies, and institutions. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you. It makes it sound like I actually do some work. All right, so we're going to talk about financing advanced microgrids. And what do I do here, Mark? Hit
tab over here.
There we go. All right. So we're going to talk about rethinking microgrids in addition to talking about how you finance microgrids. A lot of the material that was covered in the prior presentation on deal structure is very similar to what I was going to cover. So we're going to get rid of some of the standard presentation probably and have some more dialogue, because I think it's probably more productive than just me ripping through a finance model, which includes a lot of the same finance structures, percentages of equity, debt, grant funding, and other components of the finance structure that were just covered in the prior presentation from the Connecticut Deep. How challenging the status quo with mixed-use microgrids realign institutional thinking. So when you think of microgrids, we're going to cover the ideal microgrid project or not, challenging the status quo, and how you achieve an alignment among the stakeholders. So the project I'm talking about today is the College View campus at Mississippi State University. It was new construction. It was a P3 public-private partnership between Greystar, which is the largest multifamily owner in the world, and they also operate the largest amount of collegiate housing in the country. And they developed, after winning an RFP by the state of Mississippi for Mississippi State University, to do in 3 phases over 1,000 beds of collegiate housing, retail and restaurants on this new College View campus, hotel right near the football stadium, the Bulldog Stadium, university classrooms and other academic and university offices, an aquatics and healthcare facility, and a child development center, essentially child care for university personnel. They wanted to explore doing a microgrid, so it wasn't driven by the university, it was driven by our client, Greystar. And so we had already worked with Greystar on developing CHP and solar in different locations across the country. And they said, do you have any really good ideas that will make us competitive on this RFP? And the university loved both the sustainability and the resiliency when they proposed a microgrid for the new privatized development that they were doing in partnership with Greystar. So part of what helped them win or differentiate this project was the fact that they included a microgrid in it. So it's in 3 phases. We're already into phase 2. It's essentially 4 285 kilowatt cogen units used for tri-generation. So we're doing heating, cooling, and electricity from the facilities. And they operate in islanded mode and power the different loads that are listed there above that I just went through, including collegiate housing, university facilities, the healthcare facility, and a hotel. They're also connected to absorption chillers, I mentioned, for cooling, and operate in islanded mode. And with those, we also built a central boiler plant and chiller plant. It's interesting with Greystar because as a global leader, the largest multifamily owner, they have directives that brought our attention to things that we weren't really thinking about, that a lot of the industry is going to start thinking about. So we certainly all hear about socially responsible investing, and that institutional investors and other large corporate and global entities are touting sustainability and resiliency. But when you look at it from the approach of a fund of funds that's the largest fund of multifamily, or apartment and collegiate housing facilities in the world, the scale at which they look at things with almost 2,000 properties makes things very programmatic. So when they look at it, they don't just say, hey, we'd like sustainability and resiliency. Instead, they're investors in their different funds. For example, their collegiate housing fund, BlackRock and Goldman Sachs say, we want you to have sustainability and resiliency incorporated. And not only do they take into account benchmarks, they also have studies that show student behavior, show the reactions and the impact on mental health and personal health of having power outages. And they want to be able to report back to their investors as well as their students and parents that they've addressed all issues. So when they have the amount of data they do and the number of professionals they do looking at the impacts of resiliency and sustainability, they're not just looking at CO2 offsets, they're looking at the long-term health and wellness of their students and their residents, but also the story to be able to report to their partners, the public universities, as well as their investors who are the largest institutional investors. So they take this very seriously and they look at it programmatically in the ways we hadn't really considered. And that's on the sustainability front. On resiliency, they also look at it in terms of insurance. They say, what does it mean? What's the insurance impact if there's an outage? So they're not used to, we're saying, oh, how long can we stay operational for critical facilities? Instead, they're saying, how long do we stay operational to avoid some sort of insurance claims that something goes wrong in our facility? They say it's both economic as well as risk avoidance, not just the type of risk we are typically looking at for being resilient and operational, but instead that their underwriters of their facilities are saying you have to be resilient, not just what's your emergency plan, but what's your complete resiliency plan. So Graystar took this very seriously, and their funds actually now have fund requirements that they're implementing for resiliency. And when they're looking at sustainability, they're going beyond our typical resiliency of, get greenhouse gas reductions, and they're going to embodied carbon. So they're always looking at what's next, not what's the industry standard now. So who here has talked about or is aware of embodied carbon? Wow. Okay, so the people in this room are generally, I think, colleagues who are the most up to date on sustainability and resiliency. We've all worked together in different ways throughout the years on projects and in the industry and stakeholder meetings. So they just brought this to our attention the last couple months. So they're now looking at sustainability, not just in their construction of how can they reduce greenhouse gases, but what's the embodied carbon in the complete construction of the facility. So they're saying, when we build a new facility, what is the amount of carbon in all of the building materials in the supply chain and all the way down to the carbon that's in all the building materials in the construction of the plant, not just once it's complete, what's the CO2 or the greenhouse gas avoidance, what's the sustainability of the facility. So Graystar really pushes us to think about things differently and to push the envelope in terms of ensuring their success and making sure that they're a global leader in sustainability. Joe.
Do they consider the carbon input to a non-carbon containing material, like the amount of carbon that goes into producing a ton of steel, as opposed to the amount of carbon that is encased in a wood product?
I don't know. I think so. They've just started pushing us on embodied carbon, and they're making that a part of their sustainability plans for their most current fund. Okay. So we're learning as we go along. I bring that up as a concept here because in the last 2 months they've said on all new projects we need to start looking at embodied carbon. So we'll be answering those types of questions, Joe.
Yeah, I just read an article that in Finland they're building multi-story, almost a skyscraper, 14-story type buildings out of wood.
Yeah. Because
they consider the sustainable resource of wood as embodied carbon, takes it out of the system for 50 years or whatever the life of the building is, and that's a high value.
they're also doing stick construction for a lot of their buildings for that reason. So I guess by asking the question, you're sort of answering it as well, is they're taking that into account. And so they're making wood construction a big part of their new facilities. And that's actually, this College View campus was wood construction.
And I think there's a distinction too. Embodied carbon and steel would be the carbon embodied make it. Carbon cost
Yes.
probably be a negative relative to wood. They talk about, but they also talk about sequestered carbon. I think that's what they're really looking at.
Yeah.
It's sequestered there and stays there for a long period of time if you use it. I just was on a webinar yesterday about controlled forestry from exactly that perspective. How much longer you might leave a tree before you harvest it, because another year or two after age 26, it embodies, sequesters X amount more carbon, and it's still perfect for construction. So
Well, the tree stops at a certain point. When the tree reaches mature growth, their
He's saying there's a couple
their carbon
more years.
additions is very small.
Right, they stop at 26 typically for harvesting the woods, but now they're looking at going longer, just a couple of years, but it increases the sequestration that much more, and it doesn't impact the usability.
Yeah, their point on our monthly call last month was we've looked at net zero buildings that people claim are net zero that actually, are 80 years worth of carbon to make net zero. So they're actually evaluating these things so that what they say is actually true. So that it's you have a question?
Yeah. By the way, the same argument on electric transportation vehicle cost of dead into the making vehicle.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious, is there any reason that maybe I missed it, but that solar wasn't included in this? Because this would be like a college campus. Solar is so emblematic of clean, and we just didn't pencil out, or it had too much embodied carbon.
Didn't pencil out while they were in the middle of sort of acquiring a bunch of new portfolios. We had proposed that I actually could go back to it, but we have solar on different facilities, and there's no incentive, there's no rec market. They don't necessarily care all that much about economics sometimes to say, hey, let's do it anyway. And I think more over the next. This was approved 3 years ago. And I think
this far down in the cost curve. So.
Yeah, and I think through different acquisitions, it's gotten higher and higher on their radar. So, like we're doing a solar and storage project for them at Sacramento State right now in California, and they're approving solar at more and more of their facilities. So this was in large part, resiliency and sustainability and cost, because once we proved out, which I'll go through it in a minute, at the top of here, they had proposed when we came into it, split systems throughout, and essentially what we worked with them on the concept was you're really talking about life cycle cost was their biggest driver here, was the life cycle cost of decentralized systems was much more than the cost of centralized systems. And then when they took into account resiliency, being able to take diesel generators out of the project, be able to operate in islanded mode because there are lots of outages from strong tornadoes and storms down there, it became a no-brainer for them. And really, what we're going to talk about now is the ideal microgrid project. So what are some things that people think of traditionally as making the ideal microgrid project?
Being able to island and continue running when there's disruption.
Yeah. And then what are some of those factors that determine whether you undertake it or not?
Centralized systems. How you value resiliency.
How you value resiliency. State incentives generally come into play. Deregulated markets, having utilities that have interconnection guidelines. So the reason we raised those as ideal project is we had none of those there. So they had no guidelines, no state incentive. Typically people think of, Northeast or California or even, coastal West as being places that are ideal because the electricity is so expensive, and people think Southeast, you can't make it work. But the spark spread is so substantial there because gas is so cheap from the Permian Basin. And surprisingly, electricity is up at 10 cents a kilowatt hour. It's not in the 5 cents, 6 cents range as we typically think of the Southeast. So my point in this is there are no state incentives. It's in a region where people don't traditionally think of a microgrid as being possible. And most of the factors that you want to come into alignment are not there. We had a municipal utility that was like, you're going to do what? To who? How? And they thought we were crazy. I mean, when these guys, it's basically like a family that runs the municipal utility. TVA had no guidelines for us interconnecting. And really, ultimately, we got them comfortable with the fact that we would meet the electric code. And they said, okay, fine. If your engineers can show us that you'll meet the code, we're okay. If you're not going to feed back to our system, fine. So we have our relays and controls on so we don't feed back, and it works. But primarily, my point there is no ideal microgrid project. We talk about the stars needing to align, but Connecticut has all these programs. New Jersey's been talking about this for a long, long, long time. And we were able to get this done in a matter of like 18 months in Starkville, Mississippi. So there is no ideal microgrid project. There is no ideal state. It's a matter of just starting to do it. It's a matter of just, getting folks aligned and knocking down the roadblocks. There are solutions to all those items that come up. Financing, we're going to talk about in just a minute. But each of those things, whether it's permitting, environmental regulations, state regulations, there's a way to have the dialogue, but then not end up in a perpetual dialogue. You got to move these projects forward. I mean, honestly, from resiliency bank to, funding feasibility studies, part of what I want to talk about challenging the status quo is everyone in here has the capability of getting these projects done and has for the last 10 years. But how many microgrid projects are there in New Jersey? I mean, Sandy was 2012, and we're still talking about it. Microgrid should just be the norm. I mean, we've already concluded that the electrical infrastructure is antiquated and not substantial enough to handle major storms and handle voltage fluctuations. We have the technology for microgrid controllers, solar, CHP, battery storage, fuel cells. We talk about these pilot projects, but the time for pilot projects was 10 years ago. But we're still talking about pilot projects. I mean, they should just be the norm. And when you had institutional buy-in, and it helps to have one of the largest owners, investors of real estate in the world, but they just kept moving. They didn't slow down. They didn't wait until all the stars were aligned. Instead, they realized alignment by getting all the parties at the table together and working through every single one of the solutions, because students had to be in this building by August of last year, or in these buildings.
And so you were able to get the regular sort of blessing, if you will, because finance, to your point, right, we should have built this, I agree 1,000% 5 years ago. But finance is scared when you step outside of campus here that you're going to get halfway through and somebody's going to throw the challenge in, right, legally. And even with the alignment, and I'll just say it out loud, politically, of these microgrids, which, in case anybody missed, is 87% of the electorate. It has been challenging to get the legislature, none of them to see or hear what Connecticut has said and you have said. And so for us, and that's where we were talking. How does Graystar? We deal with we work with. It's one of those things where you gotta. Let me ask you: did you have to work out all those regulatory hurdles, or at least get the blessing, so that they said, as long as we can finance it and no one bothers us, what do we do?
I think the one-word answer is football. They take Bulldogs football really seriously, and when the president of the university says this is what we're doing, and the university's progressive, this is one block from the stadium. Basically, I guess my point in that is kind of a joke in saying football, but Mississippi State University, the dialogue that the university has with the regulators is, we're going to go ahead and do this. Is this cool with you? And they go, yeah, man, that's cool.
Well, like New Jersey, if a certain guy named president says we're go, we're go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the politics are different. I mean, the politics there are
There.
the politics there are serious.
Yeah.
You know, you can't minimize the politics there. But the need for everyone nodding their head together for complete consensus before doing anything is not the case there. As we're here, we don't do anything until everyone has said, okay, we've socialized this enough, we've gone through this enough, we've had enough stakeholder meetings, we've had enough comment periods. You know, we now have all these sets of criteria that say we can move forward. And I mean, you know, even Connecticut has done a great job, and we went to all the stakeholder meetings in 2012 and 13, and rounds 1 and 2 she was talking about, but they ultimately took too long too. So I mean, we're based in New Jersey, but we're off developing microgrids in Mississippi, not in New Jersey, because we're still talking about it.
Fred had the best PowerPoint slide of anyone with the Tappan Zee Bridge being actually built and completed before a 1 megawatt engine was.
It was so much easier.
It was a great one. I
Yeah.
laugh at that.
Well, let's talk. I mean, let's talk about just finance structures quickly, because I do think it's relevant to have the dialogue and sort of go off of the typical construct, because I don't think financing is the issue, and I'll raise it on, you know, one of the points a little bit down. So this project is a JV of Blue Sky Power and Greystar. So we both invested money into the project because when we gave them these straight up ESA numbers on us funding the microgrid completely, they said, well, we want to do that too. So essentially it's a JV. We do all the O&M, handle the investment in the project. They invest with us into their, you know, and then provide the energy to their College View LLC.
Are you talking about investing in the microgrid or
In the
investing in the whole project?
In the microgrid. In the microgrid. So yeah, so we co-invested with them in the microgrid project. Essentially, you know, that microgrid then sells the power to their SPE that owns the student housing, mixed use development. It's really cool. There's also a Bulldog Amphitheater there. And it's a really neat new college campus as you see innovative, you know, portions of campuses go up.
SPV1 wrap is the PPA taker. SPV2 wrap is the PPA provider.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So, but they're used to complex, innovative structures. So when they saw our ESA model, they said, okay, cool, we want to be a part of it. So let's go through some of the finance structures on this. So it's you know, privatized collegiate housing owner, Greystar owns the microgrid with Blue Sky Power. We operate it, and you know, we sell power back to College View LLC. So equity, the reason I raise funding not really being a problem is we have $500 million to deploy right now. And that's now. That's not a hypothetical discussion of trying to fund projects. That is one of the largest equity funds has allocated $500 million to us, to Blue Sky Power, to go invest in projects. So there's no lack of capital in the market. And I think a lot of the discussion typically is how are we going to get these funded, as where we know how to get these projects funded. And we'll go through a finance model in a minute, but there's not really a question of funding. Yes, we can go through the different finance structures. So debt. I mean, we can talk about bonds, from private activity bonds to, you know, economic development authority, different low interest loans and guarantees. Connecticut has their Green Bank. We had our resiliency bank. I don't know if they loaned any money. Did they loan any money?
Part of it was done.
ERB?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Are they still active?
They're dead.
We're completing projects, no new financing, but we're still completing projects.
So, yeah. So I mean, on debt, I mean, the low interest loans, you know, loan guarantees, you know, issuances through different improvement authorities and economic development authorities through low interest loans, as well as, you know, standard, you know, institutional debt financing. Tax equity, you know, not much different from our, you know, solar PPA discussions or others. There's 10% CHP grant, 30% solar, ITC, although now I guess we're at 26%, and we'll continue to ratchet down, as well as the battery storage. you can take the incentive on certain portion of battery storage as well.
Did any of this project qualify for an ITC?
Yeah, for 10% CHP ITC.
CHP one?
Yeah, which actually we're submitting now. Investment tax credit taken on this project, securitized revenue streams, which we utilize the ESA revenue for, later bringing in debt into a project, not on this project, but typically that's what we do. REC agreements, again, not solar, not RECs in this, but we're talking general finance structures, as well as DR revenue. Let's see, what alt tab? So in going through, can I use the mouse on this? So in going through project, essentially we broke this project into 3 phases. And like I said, we're on phase 2 right now, and 3 starts in about a year. And start with the electric load, the site gas load, the hot water load, chilling load. Move these up here. And the chilling load for the site, the average electrical load, and the low temp hot water, and then our tons of cooling required. Interestingly, this project also works well because of the incredible demand for cooling there. So they use so much cooling, they use air conditioning almost year round. And so we have substantial use of the thermal heat recovery in the summertime. So in a lot of places in the Northeast where we may not have much use for thermal in the summer, there we have a ton of use for it in the summer.
Ben, I was going to ask you, I'm looking at your electric load, your peaks are like 2.6 or 2.7, something like that. Yet you only have 1.14 in terms of generation. What is that, load shedding, or do you have emergency generation? How do you or you pick up off of the
pick up off the utility? Yeah, so we're about 60% of the load most of the time.
So
I mean, most of the time we're at 100%, but
Sure.
you know, at peaks.
in terms of revenue, are they allowed to sub-meter and charge tenants for heating, cooling, and electric?
Yes, so we are charging we have it broken down by each of the different facilities. So we have student housing, we have university facilities, we have retail and restaurants, and we have flow meters on those, and then are able to
When you
build a
talk about
separate
student
tenant.
housing, it's sub-metering the whole student housing unit, not the individual apartment.
The whole unit, not the individual apartment. That's right. It's considered dormitory, not multifamily. So total project's about $7.1 million. Like I said, we have this broken down in 3 phases. Don't necessarily have to go through all the costs, but this is, you know, our typical model on the cost profile, basically going through the different components of electrical and thermal infrastructure, installation costs, you know, overhead, contingency, et cetera, fees, soft costs. And like I said, here, no incentive other than the ITC. And then on the performance profile, we walk through the facility. Again, we broke these down by phases. And then here we have the cost savings from fuel, as well as the offset for electricity. And then the O&M savings, like we said, were a big driver in life cycle costs for them in not utilizing the decentralized systems that they're used to using. And then we have that broken out by the 3 phases, offsets of electric and thermal.
So Ben, you know, that can be a big, and there could be a big swing in maintenance offsets.
Yeah.
What you might have put in, but you didn't, versus what you did. Did you propose those numbers, and did they accept them, or did they come from their data?
They came from their data sources, yeah. We had, like I said, they do everything so programmatically. They have a company that always runs those for them, so we didn't make it up, which we felt much more comfortable with, is instead of saying, here are our assumptions and why, we said, here are the assumptions we need data for, provide us the data. Because they would have called bullshit and eaten us alive on each line item.
No,
Instead,
I recognize they have a lot of data. So what's the magnitude of that savings, that offset?
For which?
The maintenance savings from not doing individual and using centralized instead?
yeah, so a total of For all three phases, it's about $300,000.
Was there an interconnection cost for the utility in there?
No,
So that's-
no. And it was new construction too. So we benefited a lot on this project. So again, on some of challenging the status quo or the ideal microgrid project is we were starting from scratch. So we were able to, the model was based on status quo of a decentralized system, go build how you normally do versus going ahead and building this now. So we actually, rather than coming in just building the project, it was through their GC, through their electrical and mechanical subs who were on site, or going to be on site anyway. So we worked in the cost estimating that they were doing on their general construction.
It's nice synergy.
Yeah, it was. It was actually one of the first new construction projects we did. And it sure is nice working on new construction as opposed to retrofit. Or sometimes you look out in a retrofit, they're about to do a large rehab of a facility and it fits in well, or do a new addition and it's the time to do a project. So then walking through, finance model again, I mean, we have all the typical inputs of O&M rates, ESA rates, tax rates, escalators on utility, gas and electric. This is the developer and financier economic profile, and then the customer economic profile. Ultimately, it led to the cumulative net impact for them of $2.2 million over the 20-year term for them. So they decided to go ahead and do the project. And like I said, not only that, that's on the SPE level, they also decided to go ahead and co-invest with us on the project. So, we can go more into finance structures, but I think given the prior presentation, let's see. I think the dialogue we were just having, I think on some of the timing in finance is more instructive. So, I mean, I think the dialogue on answering some of the questions and also trying to figure out how we move some projects more quickly because the demand is now.
And one other question, and I'm kind of trying to dig into these, non-direct savings.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned at the outset that they recognize, the client will recognize the benefits to students' welfare.
Yes,
and
they take that very
insurance
seriously.
costs. Is there a number in the pro forma for those, or was that just a?
Not in our pro forma. If they ran that in another way on the project as a whole, I don't know. And like I said, this was not quite 3 years, like 2 years. Our final modeling when they signed off on the project was November of 17, so 2 years and 2 months. Like I said, they continue to evolve quickly. So I'd say those things related to student health and welfare and the studies they did on the impact of resiliency to mental health, we thought were fascinating. I don't know whether they quantify those. I mean, I know they quantify them. I think now, since they've started to evaluate those and get the data, they're probably incorporating them into their projects that have a level of resiliency.
And presumably that would have to translate into an extra, X dollars per square foot of rental value. You got to monetize it somehow. So, that a dormitory that is resilient has a higher rental value than one that isn't. So are you seeing that yet? Or?
Yeah, they are. They're taking into account their facilities that are resilient versus those that are not resilient, and they're marketing them to residents, not just in student housing, but also in multifamily. And they have sort of different tiers that they provide, and they're pushing that even further on EV charging and incorporating, the value of having different modes of transportation, similar to the way that LEED gives points for, proximity to public transportation and different public services. They have a way of structuring the value of, LEED certified buildings, access to public transportation, sustainability and resiliency, and how that factors into pricing for rent.
Ben, I was going to ask you, you said they invested with you as a co-investor in the project. The 2.2 million you were showing as their savings is really for operating. If they were
For the
operating
operating
more.
entity.
What kind of what do they get as an investor in terms of cash flow? Is it just the tax credit?
Yeah, it's like a no, I mean it's a
markup on the operating costs.
Yeah, I mean there's markup on the ESA revenue. Ultimately, just a straight pre-tax unlevered return on this was about 14%. Ultimately, some of the costs on O&M and construction were a little bit higher, so we're at like 12%.
Emergency life safety, you got to put generation in there, diesel?
No, we took diesel out. So initially, when they had split systems, they also had diesel specified in here, and we were able to produce enough to completely offset the diesel. So not only life safety, we actually on the transfer switches and the different loads on there are more than just life safety. So we made it's enough that not only that we keep all the chillers and all the cooling going during
So how or what do they, since you have less generation and you have peak load, how do you prioritize or distribute it? Do you have a triage process that drops
We
off?
went through loads with them, and they just pick which loads they want as a priority.
So what did they prioritize?
They prioritize cooling.
No, not cooling. Did they prioritize housing versus academic buildings?
Oh, yeah.
Versus what?
Yeah, housing, student health and well-being is their number one priority.
So they can shut down the other stuff and keep the housing functional, so they don't have to.
Yeah, I mean the clubhouse. There's also a clubhouse with pool and gym and academic facilities and amphitheater and all this and all sorts of cool features that the university has. But the priority is student housing and the keeping cooling in the student housing. But how about timing? I mean, what about talking about, I mean, on the New Jersey perspective, we're talking about this as it relates to Starkville, Mississippi, and from the date this was proposed until it was built and students were in was less than 2 years. So they signed off on this November 11th of 2017, meaning gave the final stamp of approval. We presented to the university, with Graystar, the university, all the university executives and the leadership team, from student affairs to housing to chief legal and finance officers. And they all said, okay, go ahead. That was in October. We wrapped up all the cost estimating, November, and it was approved. And then students were in August of this year, ready for the fall semester, less than 2 years. That includes coordination with the utility, all the proper relay settings, all the inspections and witness tests, et cetera. If that can happen in 20 months or so, why can't that happen everywhere?
And just, I think one issue here is I assume that this is effectively a single bus behind the meter so that we're not dealing with the rights of way issue, first of all.
That's right. The right-of-way issues are not there.
And so, understood, and there's a lot of issues that we deal with here in New Jersey. But, we're seeing, so on the energy resiliency package is probably a good example, which is influenced by a multitude of factors, including state procurement issues and federal procurement issues. It's taken us 3 years to tee up the project, and then less than 2 years to do the project. So I think that's part of the process here. So we can build it in 2 years.
I guess I wasn't talking construction was about 18 months. I guess that teeing up the project was about 4 months.
So that's the difference, is the 4 months versus 3 years. Sorry.
But on the financing, I guess if the tenor of the conversation today is on financing, and we know that the inputs are, equity, perhaps debt, tax equity, DR revenue, how do you charge for resiliency? Meaning we take into account the value of resiliency as opposed to, just backup generators. What's the true value of being operational in outages, either for a commercial entity in terms of productivity for a hospital, we're doing a multi-state hospital survey on resiliency that shows, the number of outages they have, impact on rescheduling, impact on patients, impact, on not being able to utilize ORs and other facilities fully, and quantifying that. We know how to quantify these different items. So I guess on the financing, opening it up to the group. I mean, what are some of the other issues people have that on financing that seem to be roadblocks?
Well, from this standpoint, I mean, this project I think would be, forget the fact that you're in Mississippi, which would make it a lot more easy to permit and get through the channels and all that than here in Jersey. But in many ways, it more mirrors a campus cogeneration situation as opposed to a real microgrid. I mean, one of the things with the microgrid, and this is a problem I ran into up in Connecticut, is that they specified you have to build for the peak anytime it occurs. So we had to put in generation to be able to service the peak and service it for a 5-week period of outage whenever it occurred. And that really changed the economics too. That's why we had to go to virtual net metering up there. That allowed us to kind of run at full bore and not use it in the 3 buildings that we put it in. So it was very effective at making that. We didn't have that.
Did you just do natural gas generators or diesel
yeah,
generators?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my thought on that is, if that was the case here, we would have added some additional natural gas generators to be available.
Yeah, but your capital would have gone way up.
It would have. It would have been without sitting there. I mean, we are looking at that for some other facilities in Pennsylvania right now for hospitals.
But a lot of ones in here in New Jersey, a lot depends on how they define what they want from microgrid.
Yeah, and
it's going to be like Connecticut, where they say we want you to be able to serve the peak whenever the outage occurs for a 5-week period. Without virtual net metering or something like that, you're not going to be able to do it. You're building too much generation that's going to sit idle.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Is there any discussion in the project of extending the microgrid to other facilities on campus, just dorms, for example?
Yeah,
Conversation.
So these are dorms.
They're new, right?
They're new.
Yeah.
And so since this was a new development, someone may have asked that question at some point, but it was kept to this whole new development of the South Campus. And they actually have, a 10 megawatt peaker plant on campus. So there was, on the main original campus. So that wasn't really much of a discussion. Questions?
I'll offer that some of the financing challenges that we've had just installing standalone natural gas generators is that we have a one-to-one retrofitting cost for our facilities that doesn't pencil out no matter what you do within the generation. So retrofitting is substantially different projects across the country. So while we can finance aspects of that, we have sort of, there's still additional costs that not be baked into the form of that. So that's limiting project partners to sponsor some of the should look like
Yeah.
I think the perfect example of that, we talked about Energy Resilience Bank. Back in the day when it was first launched, we had this gob of money from HUD
Yeah.
that couldn't find a home because to retrofit heating districts in old urban settings is just impossible. So there were so many projects that were like, don't even bother. Then they had to expand I think what it started with wastewater first. And nobody's applying.
I thought it was just wastewater.
I think it was just wastewater. Then we expanded hospitals, and there were a few that made sense, but it was, it's hard. So if you're blessed with a greenfield, that's great because,
Well, now I was using this as challenging the status quo because there weren't incentives there. There weren't sort of the ideal alignment that, we think we have here of, greater spark spread, expensive electric, different incentives that are available, but on, CHP, RECs on solar, ITC, et cetera.
Right.
So that's part of the reason I used this was challenging the status quo. I will say now I feel like maybe I should have used a Pennsylvania project or something that pencils out, and a lot of that pencils out on a retrofit with upgrade, a facility that needs new infrastructure, meaning new boilers, new chillers, lighting. I mean, we generally roll it all into one project, and that helps the economics on the resiliency.
And behind all this, the last 3 years, as you said, cost of solar and storage continues to drop. So the economics are tilting anyway.
And the cost of natural gas, I mean, when you have some sort of natural gas generation, either CHP or just natural gas generators, the cost of natural gas certainly helps, right?
Yeah.
I mean, most of this discussion we wouldn't really be having without, historically low natural gas.
We also have a typical New Jersey fashion, right? We approach things in very defined buckets. Our regulators are DCA separated from DEP, who doesn't know anything about the permits for the air permit, doesn't want to talk to them. So we're in all these buckets, and the one thing where we think we're about to be successful in taking these things out is the marriage of looking at these individual stakeholders in ESIP and energy efficiency and all the ROIs that are baked into the reduction side that have to get blended with the ROIs that are going to be made in the production side.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last bucket, which, no fault of theirs because they're not allowed to talk to us, the utility, right? We're all just getting, this is as close as we're allowed to be, right? And we're not even allowed to say hello. And so without literally working with them on looking at their infrastructure, their distribution system, where we place our generation, how we combine up things like that's why I asked about emergency gen in Woodbridge. You can see this marriage of redevelopment law and ESIP and microgrid and a whole bunch of things, but it's only because you got a mayor who's, not going to take no for an answer, who's standing over everybody saying, this is going to happen. We're doing it by redevelopment law. By the way, we're going out on the street February 15th. Sorry, everybody.
They don't even have a football team.
Yes.
But it takes, I mean, I guess the point in that is, Adam, that the industry requires, substantial heft to move anything, so regardless of where you are. So here, heavies like Greystar and the university are able to push it through when normally, if you showed up at Starkville Utilities, they'd laugh at you. But their largest customer is the university, so they're going to say, okay. Or in Woodbridge with the mayor, like Gloucester Township, we have our, the mayor pushes things. We did, landfill project, landfill solar project, but as a redevelopment zone similarly. You have to be innovative. But I will say on that stakeholders being aligned, we do a lot of projects in Pennsylvania as well. And I'll say, PICO and PGW, as well as, the PUC, the Commonwealth, DCED, the different entities there are so supportive of doing projects. Even though we're a New Jersey-based company, we're greeted, with open arms there as we're here. Like you said, there are all these silos of, we can't talk to you, and or they're casual conversations. But as far as moving projects, it takes a substantial amount of drive, patience, determination to move things.
Right. Well, and everybody's heard this from before. Mark's going to talk about the world of procurement here, but at some level, doesn't this all beg to the fact that we're not going to solve this also. We should get out of the plane and start figuring out, on the ground with these 12 that are left, which, by the way, the 12 that are left, I can speak for half the people in the room, of the 12, there's actually 6. And when I mean that, it's because all of our gosh darn loads been cut in half because, I can't tell the hospital to wait with the heart attack patient. It's really just not advisable. And so we're losing critical load every day to decisions that have to be made because they've been waiting too long. And of course, but I will close saying, you said there's a lot of money out there. I could not agree. We don't have any problem financing all the microgrids. That's an easy thing. What we need to do is get some punch to be able to say these are the 12 that are going to go. These are the learning lessons, and go.
Well, that's right. I mean, even those projects. I mean, going back to Connecticut, there were rounds of projects and the feasibility studies of those projects, and only a handful of them were going to go, and they got stretched out a long time. I mean, we submitted for feasibility studies for some of those in 2012. It was just such a waiting game on the next round. Similarly here, but on the finance side, I mean, even on capital, I'm talking yield hurdles, IRRs here in the 12 to 14%. but even our capital has become so comfortable with it, we can get yields now from 8 to 12% and don't require, sort of the substantial speculative returns that were the case a few years ago. My point is that capital markets are becoming more comfortable with these constructs and wanting to deploy capital here.
Did Greystone want to use, since this was new construction, any other green building guidelines as a baseline in their process and have the vendors apply like peer?
They do. They have their own set of guidelines that they hand the contractors and say build to these criteria. And we did an energy master plan with them years ago, and one of the biggest recommendations there was having set criteria for all your new to build projects. Yes, sir.
Following on something you were talking about, the greenfield, and we've been talking about that a little bit through the conversation. There's been kind of a nice special circumstance where you buy equipment anyway, you build it from scratch. In your work in Pennsylvania, to what extent do the projects work better if you're physically needing to replace a lot of the equipment that would go into the microgrid with new, to the extent that in some cases you don't, but you're putting in a microgrid, you're trying to push in a microgrid anyway?
Yeah, I think I just remembered on the last question, Tara wanted me to repeat each of the questions.
Yes, I did, but.
So I failed miserably on that, but I mean, the question is, to what degree in Pennsylvania does it make more sense when you're replacing outdated infrastructure already? And 100%, I mean, it makes complete sense. Projects a lot of times don't work when someone just replaced new boilers and new chillers.
That's where the so if you had to prioritize at the level of the state or a county or somewhere, the ones that might bubble to the top in terms of the economics would be ones that, hey,
deferred maintenance in bad shape.
I'll hold off.
Yeah. It's all really asset management as we're coming down with your street openings or anything else.
But there are other criteria too. I mean, when you look at the value of quantifying resiliency, a lot of facilities, manufacturing, healthcare, senior living, others, they have voltage drops and frequency irregularities and issues that they're happening more and more often. And so, different pieces of equipment, from manufacturing equipment to hospital equipment, are going off and tripping more regularly and have to cycle back on. You're able to quantify that lost productivity or the cost of not being able to operate that machinery or serve those patients. And so that factors into it as well. So not just looking at is there outdated infrastructure that needs to be replaced on thermal and electrical side, but is there equipment that's not as productive as it can be, or the facility's not as productive as it can be because it doesn't have reliable power? Another way to triangulate.
Thank you so much, Ben. I know this has been a great discussion. We could probably continue. But I have to admit, I told them to set up lunch so we're not disturbed in a room that I don't really have reserved. So, folks, if you could please file out, and then to your left, on the right-hand side, the conference room that was right in front of you, and you came out of the elevator. I have them set up lunch in there. So, if you could please grab yourself some lunch and then come back in, that'd be great. Thank you so much. And hopefully you'll stay for a while. And,
I'm here.
Okay.
We're having micro sales.